In this video, I'm going to cover using GXT and ExtWebComponents. I'll be using GXT as the front end in this project. I'll start by importing an existing project for testing, and then I'll render a basic web component, which is simply put, a custom HTML element. Then I'll render a Sencha button using a web component. After that, I'll render a Sencha chart using a web component. And after that, I'm going to show how GXT imports the resources, and then I'll show how to make changes and debug them. So let's get started. What I want to do is go to the Github project to start with. And it's under the Sencha org sandbox-ewc-public. And in this project, I've got a few bare bones projects to show how the features work together. And the one I want to focus on today is the GXT and ExtWebComponents project. So I'll click on that. And in the README, I have some notes on what the project does. To start with, I show how to create the project from scratch, but today we're going to import the project into the IDE, JetBrains, IntelliJ IDEA, and what I want to do is basically show how it's all wired up and ready to go. So just a note right off, we need to log into the npm repo. So in this case, we're at the 7.1 EA version, so I'm going to use the early adopter version. So when you come back later, when this is released, it's going to show you which npm repo has the production bits. So to get started, I'm going to go to the terminal and I'm going to paste this in, and I've already registered for a login. And in this case, you'll need to do that as well. There'll be directions in the README on how to do that. And I'm going to click enter and go ahead and log in. And then I'm going to enter my username and my password and my email. Okay, now that I've logged in, I'm going to go back to the GitHub repo, and what I want to do is look for the cloning feature. So I'm going to go to the root of the project. I'm going to click on clone, click copy of the bits that I need to copy it with, and then I'm going to paste it in. Whoop, that doesn't work, so I'm going to go git clone and paste it in. So I've installed git, so that would be a requirement here. And what I want to do is just clone it into my favorite directory locally. Now I'm ready to import it into the IDE. So I'm going to go to the IDE and I'm going to import the project. I'm going to go to the training directory, Ext JS, and what I want to do is select the root of the project, not the root of the repository that I've cloned, because I've got more than one project in here. So it's called sandbox-gxt-ewc. So I'm going to select that. It's an existing Maven project in this case. So I'm going to select next, and I'm going to keep all the defaults. It's not a multi-module, and I'm going to select next. I'm going to select next and just keep all the defaults. I have Java 1.8 installed. Okay, this is the name of the artifact and it's being reflected as the project name. I'll keep that and say yes, because I already have an existing project configuration from the previous install. Okay, the next step, I want to see if this project is going to run by default. There are two steps I need to do. Is one, set up the launcher for Gwt, and the other piece is I got to download the npm node module. So I'm going to go ahead and add the configuration for the Gwt launcher to start with. So I'm going to select add, go to Gwt, and just name it debug app. And I'm going to select the default module, and then I'm going to give it a gigabyte. Let's go 1G. It's a little simpler to write. And we want to run all the modules. This is the default entry point, Gxt GWC Project HTML. Okay, I'm not going to use the JavaScript debugger in this tutorial, but we can cover that in a future tutorial. Okay, so I'm going to select OK, and let's look at the pieces in this. The next step is just one note here. If you're using GXT, you'll have to use the Maven settings to download the GXT bits. Let's just look what that means. In the POM, there's instructions on where the repo sits, and you'll need a login as a customer to get to those bits. If you don't have a login, let's just look at how you'd get a login. So if I go back to the README and go to the project, there's some directions here right up the beginning. Log into Maven using settings.xml. I'm not going to cover this. You can click on this and go through that. Okay, now that we've logged into Maven, we have the Maven configuration wired up. We have the Gxt project configured. Let's just test the Gxt project to make sure it's working right. And so let's just start up the debugger. Okay, great. The project is loading and ready to debug. But what we're missing are the web components in this project, and that's because the libraries haven't been loaded yet. And so what does that mean? So let's look at the project architecture to start with. We're going to go to the source directory, and then we'll look at what the project configuration looks like. So at the root of the project, this is basically the artifact name. So if you look at the pom.xml, you can see the name of the project is the same as the artifact. The next piece is, you notice it's a Maven project, but it also has a package.json. The package.json are the Npm instructions to download and run scripts. So to start with, we only have one dependency in here, and this downloads the ExtWebComponents from Sencha, from the Sencha repo. And that's all we need. And this is a vanilla JS configuration. One thing I'm not covering here today is a Webpack configuration, which is a bundler and bundles all the resources together and puts them into the web app directory. I'm not going to cover that in this episode. Keep your eyes open. We'll have another episode with that in mind. What I want to do is actually right-click on the package, and I'm going to use the internal tool to run the npm install instead of going to the terminal and running it. So I'm just going to select npm install, and it won't install unless you're logged into the npm repo for the @Sencha scope. So keep that in mind. If you see an error here, be sure you're logged in appropriately, and it should work just fine. Okay, now I've downloaded the node modules. You'll see that the node modules are all the libraries. And the one we'll be using today is the Sencha library. And the Sencha library, if you look in, you'll see all the bits and resources for the JavaScript resources and the CSS resources for the Sencha web components. Okay, great. So now I have the web components, the resources. Now, one other thing to note, we need a web app directory. So what is the web app directory? So if we look in source main web app, in this configuration, the web app directory is going to be configured directly from source main web app. So let's look at the Maven instructions real quick. So we need to actually copy the resources from the node modules because we're using this in a JavaScript standalone format. That means we have to copy the resources from the node modules. If we're using Webpack would be doing the duty of actually bundling the resources and moving it to the web app directory. But in this case, it's a simpler configuration to show you how you can simply input the charts into the web app directory. Okay, so in this configuration, we're just using a plain old JavaScript standalone format, which means we need to move the JavaScript resources. And so we're going to go to the pom.xml, and I've written a plugin in here, instructed the plugin to copy the resources to the web app directory. This is the same kind of duty a Webpack or parseling plugin can implement, but we're going to use Maven to do the job, the heavy lifting here today. So in this case, we're going to copy the resources from the Sencha node modules directory and move them into the web app directory. Okay, so that means we're going to move them into the Sencha. So let's run that, and we can use the Maven Tools in the IDE. So let's just load that up. We're going to load up the module. We're going to go to the plugins, and then we're going to look for the resources plugin. And what we want to do is just double click on the resources, copy resources. This basically activates the plugin and executes it. So then we can look over here. How would we know that the resources are copied to the right area? So if we look in the web app directory, we now have the node modules. In some cases, this could be copied to the target folder, but I wanted to copy here for this presentation. It does the same job. We just have to remember not to commit this to the VCS when we're executing this. Okay, so just to remind you, this is not a bundler, and we're using the resources within the node modules. And this could be done with a bundler, but I'm not going to cover that in this episode. So I'm going to go through the ExtWeb components, and you can see that there's the index.js. Okay, so let's just look at the index.js. If you look at it, we're actually bringing all the web components that Sencha has available in this index.js into the JavaScript DOM. So we could import this into the JavaScript, and we could have all the resources available to us. Okay, now that we have the basic project components wired up, we're ready to go. So let's look at the next step in this project. So I'm going to go up to the source Java component client. Now this is the GXT front end project, and I have one view called the form template. The form template is HTML template. Now, how do I use that HTML template? I have a widget which is using X templates as an interface, and this creates a binding to the HTML template and generates the safe HTML. And then it takes that and adds it and attaches it to the DOM, which is pretty slick. Okay, so that's pretty cool. Now, if we look at the HTML template, I've actually just instructed it to render my web component. And I have a web component called MyView. I have a web component called MyViewButtons. And these are custom elements. Now, it's kind of cool how you can build a custom element and import it into your HTML or GXT widget HTML and render that widget within that method. So where do these get constructed? That's the magic. Okay, so I have an ExtWebComponents.js. Now I've only created one file here. Okay, but before we move on, let's go ahead and clear the air here. So I'm going to hit Alt-Enter, and what I want to do is change the JavaScript to ECMA 2016 plus. Okay, now that I've cleared that air, let's move on. I have 3 web components in here, and the first one is a simple web component. The second one is a web component with a button composited. Now you can use the Sencha components directly, but what I wanted to show here is how you could use 2016 ECMA classes, and I wanted to show how to simply construct an HTML element with an Ext JS button. And then last but not least, the really cool feature is actually using an Ext JS chart in a web component format. And we're compositing, or I'm compositing, a button here. I just wanted to show how to configure a chart in the HTML element. Now this is pretty neat because it's quite declarative. And so you'll see that we have attributes, and these attributes have properties in them. And this configures the chart. So if you go down, let's just look at that. Now, here I am setting a chart template, and then I'm using that chart template as the inner HTML of the web component. And then we fetch some data that's pretty cool, and I'll show you how this looks in a minute. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's just look at the wiring of how we import the resources for the Ext web component. So let's look at the entry point. One of the things about Super Dev Mode is, and in the launcher above, when you launch this, it actually copies the resources to the temporary web app directory for the embedded web server. One of the challenges with that is that if you make a change in the JavaScript file and it's sitting in the temporary web app directory, it's not going to get copied the next time you actually reload the web page. Like Super Dev Mode incrementally compiles the Java and Java template or interfaces. In this case, what I did is the entry point is basically take a resource instance. I read that JavaScript, and what's nice about this is I can actually put this JavaScript file in the package that I'm importing the resources in. So this is pretty slick because I get to keep the JavaScript resources in the package that I'm actually working in and associated with. And so I import the packages on the fly. Now there's one disadvantage at this. This doesn't get minified in the context that it's in. In that case, you'd want to use a Webpack bundler. And I'll cover that in another episode. That's pretty slick when you go into a larger project context. But in this case, this is a huge win when you want to get started with a small amount of code. And let's say you just want to import the charts to get going. Now, there's a lot of great charts that you can actually add from the ExtJS library without a huge impact to your application. What this means is I can actually reload the web page, and every time I reload, it's going to pull the resources from the JavaScript file. And that makes it really slick for debugging quickly when you make changes. So I'll show you what that means here in a minute. Okay, now that I've actually showed you how all the pieces are wired up, let's get to the fun stuff. Let's see how this renders. Remember what I just said a minute ago, I would have to restart the launcher to refresh the resources in the temp web app directory. I haven't done that yet with the current configuration, so I need to do that. So I'm going to stop it, and I'm going to start it again. Once it starts, I'm going to go reload it in the web browser. What this is doing is actually copying the resources of the project into the temporary web app directory. All right, and it loaded. Okay, so right here I have the HTML form template from GXT. I have a simple web component. I have a web component with a button and a web component with a chart, which is Netflix stock data. That is pretty slick. So let's just look at that in greater detail. So let me see how I can make the changes and update the web page. So I'm going to go back to the IDE, and I want to make some changes and see what it looks like with the changes. So I'm going to remove the chart. So how would I remove the chart? One way to do it is go back to the form HTML template, and let's just comment out the custom HTML tag. So I'm going to comment it out, save it, and then I'm going to reload the page and see what it looks like. Okay, great. You see how fast that was? I commented it out and I reloaded the web page, and voila, it's ready to go with my modifications. So now I want to do this a little bit further. Let me go to the JavaScript and I'm going to change the button's name or the value in the button. So basically I'm going to hit the second web component. Let's look at the simple web component. It's basically some basic HTML. The second template here in the web component, which is this underscore template, basically the X button. It says text send. I'm going to say sending. I'm going to save it, go back, reload the web page, and see how fast this changed. Whoa, that was pretty quick. So I have sending. So what if I wanted to click on it? I have an alert. What does that alert do? So how do I listen to a third-party component and integrate with that? So I'm going to click on that. I'm going to show a message box. Let's just look at that configuration. So in this button, basically I'm adding listeners after I construct the button, the HTML element. And what I do is I call the query selector. I say for the X button, let's get that element. And then for that element, let's add a tap listener. For Ext components, you use tap to listen for the generic events. And what I do there is I actually dispatch event and say X button has a tap. So I'm basically just making it really easy to say for my custom element, I'm just going to delegate another dispatch event. And so I could listen to that in the GXT logic. So let's look at the form. So in the form, I name the button or the element my view buttons. So how does that look in the Java? So let's go to the Java, let's go to the widget, and the same context applies. So I'm going to go to the Java and look at the widget and add a listener so I could listen for that event. So I'm going to add an attach handler, and on attach, I'm going to add some ExtWebComponent listeners because I can't add a listener until that component is ready. So in the same context, what did I do here to actually make this magic happen so I could write Java and listen to the DOM at the same time? So I imported Elemental, and what that allows me to do is basically access the DOM using Java. So basically I'm going to cast this element, which is a GWT element or a GXT element in this case. I'm going to cast it to the elemental element, button L. This is really slick. Now, if you've ever used Elemental and you want to cast to the button, or you want to cast to an elemental object, you'll want to use this JS cast. Now, I found this really slick because then this allows me to do some magic here. Basically, what it allows me to do is hook in with some Java using the native add event listener. And then I use the X button tab, which I delegate from the other widget in the Ext JS button, which I dispatch from the Ext JS element. If you look, I have a dispatch event, X button tab. I'm going to go back to my widget, and then I use the Java GXT widget. I'm going to alert message box. So this is a really consistent JavaScript experience. I really like this method where we could use form templates, use the native HTML to construct your layout. You don't necessarily have to do this. You can actually composite your layouts with Java all the same and render HTML using Java. But I wanted to show a few different flavors of how you could wire it up simply by adding Ext web components and constructing. The nice thing about these web components is, or the web component format, it gives you a nice class abstraction and gives you a really easy way to actually write and encapsulate your reusable code all in one place. Now in this case, I used one file. I might in the future use separate files for each class, which is a lot similar to Java and its class structure. So this really makes it a fantastic method for adding charts from Ext JS in your GXT project. Not only can you use the charts, you could use any of the features or any of the components from Ext JS in your GXT application. So that brings me to conclusion on this video today on covering 3 web components and adding them to GXT. Thanks for watching this video today. Follow me for more tips and tricks, and I'll catch you later.